HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Social Media, Freedom of Speech, and the Future of Our Democracy. Edited by Lee C. Bollinger and Geoffrey R. Stone. Read by Graham Rowat. Opening Statement. Lee C. Bollinger and Geoffrey R. Stone. One of the most fiercely debated issues of the current era is what to do about bad speech on the Internet, primarily speech on social media platforms such as Facebook and Twitter. Bad speech encompasses a range of problematic communications: hate speech, disinformation and propaganda campaigns, encouragement of and incitement to violence, limited exposure to ideas one disagrees with or that compete with pre-existing beliefs, and so on. Because the Internet is inherently a global communication system, bad speech can arise from foreign as well as domestic sources. No one doubts that these kinds of very harmful expression have existed forever, but the premise of the current debate is that the ubiquity and structure of this newest and most powerful communications technology magnifies these harms exponentially beyond anything we have encountered before. Some argue that, if it is left unchecked, the very existence of democracy is at risk. The appropriate remedies for this state of affairs are highly uncertain, and this uncertainty is complicated by the fact that some of these forms of bad speech are ordinarily protected by the First Amendment. Yet the stakes are very high in regard to how we answer the question, because it is now evident that much of public discourse about public issues has migrated onto this new technology and is likely to continue that course into the future. Current First Amendment jurisprudence has evolved on the premise that, apart from certain minimal areas of well-established social regulation, for example, fighting words, libel, threats, incitement, we should place our trust in the powerful antidote of counter-speech to deal with the risks and harms of bad speech. Of course, that may well turn out to be the answer to our contemporary dilemmas. Indeed, one can already see the rise of public pressures on Internet companies to increase public awareness of the dangers of bad speech, and there are discussions daily in the media raising alarms over dangerous speech and speakers. Thus, it may be that the long-standing reliance on the self-correcting mechanisms of the marketplace of ideas will work again. But perhaps not. There is already a counter-risk that the increase in editorial control by Internet companies will be biased against certain ideas and speakers and will effectively censor speech that should be free. On the other hand, even those who fear the worst from bad speech being uninhibited often assert that Internet company owners will never do enough on their own to initiate the needed controls, because their basic, for-profit motivations are in direct conflict with the public good and the management of civic discourse. There is understandable concern that those who control the major Internet companies will have an undue and potentially dangerous effect on American democracy through their power to shape the content of public discourse. On this view, public intervention is necessary. It is important to remember that the last time we encountered a major new communications technology, we established a federal agency to provide oversight and to issue regulations to protect and promote the public interest, convenience, and necessity. That, of course, was the new technology of broadcasting, and the agency was the Federal Communications Commission. The decision to subject private broadcasters to some degree of public control was, in fact, motivated by some of the very same fears about bad speech that we now hear about the Internet. People thought the risks of the unregulated private ownership model in the new media of radio and television were greater than those inherent in a system of government regulation. And, like today, those who established this system felt unsure about what regulations would be needed over time in the public interest, convenience, and necessity, and they therefore set up an administrative agency to review the situation and to evolve the regulations as circumstances required. For a fuller description and analysis of these issues, see Images of a Free Press and Uninhibited, Robust, and Wide Open, A Free Press for a New Century by Lee C. Bollinger. On multiple occasions, the Supreme Court has upheld this system under the First Amendment. The formal rationale for these decisions may not apply to the Internet, but there is still plenty of room for debate about the true principles underlying that jurisprudence and their continued relevance. In any event, the broadcasting regime stands as arguably the best example in our history of ways to approach the contemporary concerns about new technologies of communication. But, of course, it may be that government intervention in this realm is so dangerous that social media platforms should be left to set their own policies, just as the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal are free to do. Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act of 1996 famously shields Internet companies from liability for speech on their platforms. Many critics of Internet companies have advocated the repeal of this law and have used the idea of its repeal as a threat to get these companies' owners to change their editorial policies, either to stop censoring or to censor more. Another approach would be to enforce existing laws that forbid foreign states and certain actors from interfering in U.S. domestic elections and politics. Everyone accepts the proposition that efforts by Russia to spread disinformation in order to foster civil strife in America is highly dangerous and properly subject to criminal prohibitions. But in a much more integrated world, especially one facing global problems, climate change, and so on, it is also true that the American public has a vital First Amendment interest in hearing and communicating with the broader international community. The problem, therefore, will be in finding the right balance between improper foreign interference and the healthy, necessary exchange of ideas on the global stage. We also need to take stock of the precise nature of the problems we are facing with bad speech on social media platforms, as well as what means other than legal intervention might be available to address the problems. Public education, changes in algorithms, the development of a more journalistic culture within the management of these platforms, government pressures on bad actors abroad, and other non-legal solutions all need to be explored. It is also possible that the constraints in existing First Amendment jurisprudence should themselves be amended, not only because the circumstances and contexts are different today, but also because experience over time with those doctrines and principles might lead some to doubt their original or continuing validity. Overall, we need to imagine as best we can what a new equilibrium should look like as we experience the impacts on our democracy of this new technology of communication. Every now and then in the history of the First Amendment, an issue comes along that not only poses a perplexing and challenging question about some aspect of First Amendment doctrine or some incremental move, but also calls into question the whole edifice of freedom of speech and press as we have come to know it in the United States. The current debates about the threats to free speech, and even to democracy itself, triggered by the evolution of our newest technology of communication, the Internet, and especially social media platforms, constitute such an occasion. The extraordinarily rapid embrace of this method of communication, in less than 2 decades, together with its pervasive presence in our lives, is both astonishing and revolutionary. This is true especially because the Internet and social media are controlled by a few corporations which are structurally designed to reserve to them primary control of this powerful new means of communication. It is now a central question in the United States and around the world whether this new means of communication strengthens what freedom of speech has marked as the ideal or threatens everything we have so painstakingly built. This book is dedicated to exploring that question and what follows from the answers we give to it. At this moment in the history of the United States, there is arguably no conundrum of greater importance. When an overwhelming majority of citizens communicates, receives information, and forms political alliances in a single place, And when that place is effectively controlled and curated by a single person or entity, or mathematical model, alarms built over decades of thought about freedom of speech and democracy are triggered. Too much censorship or too little? Those, in a sense, are the central concerns. The balance struck is always the test of a free and democratic society, because it is ultimately through speaking and listening that human beings become who they are and decide what to believe. Put simply, do entities like Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube have too much power under existing law to determine what speech we will or will not have access to on social media? Are there changes that can constitutionally be made to the current system that will improve rather than worsen the current state of affairs? And how should we think about the multinational implications of the Internet and about how policies adopted in other nations affect freedom of speech in the United States? We have invited 22 authors, all experts on this general subject, to write 18 essays describing how they see the current and future state of affairs in this new communications universe, and what they propose should be done, if anything, to address these challenges. We frame the inquiry with this brief introductory statement and a concluding one. A team from the distinguished law firm of Debevoise and Plimpton, led by Andrew Seresny, partner, has contributed an essay providing a comprehensive legal background to the current state of play in the area we are investigating. And finally, we include in this volume the report of a commission we convened to review the assembled essays and to make a set of specific recommendations about what we should do and should not do in this highly controversial area of policy and constitutional law. This is our fourth project together of this kind. We have come to this way of exploring highly controversial and complex problems by experience. We have found that giving individuals with deep expertise the opportunity to write freely about their concerns and to explore their suggestions for reform provides a depth of engagement and education for the listener that is hard to achieve in a single author volume. We believe this is a productive way of exploring a difficult problem and of driving the discussion toward recognizing new realities. Before turning to the essays, we thought it would be useful for us to set forth a few points we believe to be central to the analysis. 1. The recency of our First Amendment jurisprudence. In 2019, we published a volume of essays titled The Free Speech Century. Our purpose was to mark, indeed to celebrate, the 100th anniversary of the first Supreme Court decisions interpreting the words of the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. Although the First Amendment had been added to the Constitution in 1789 as part of the Bill of Rights, the Supreme Court did not weigh in on its meaning until 1919, during World War I. The complex jurisprudence about free speech and free press that we rely on today is, therefore, of fairly recent vintage. We are still learning. 2. The current jurisprudence of the First Amendment affords extraordinary protection to the freedoms of speech and press. No other nation in the world today, nor for that matter in history, has evolved a system of constitutional protection for the freedoms of speech and press to the degree, or with the level of analytical refinement, that we have today in the United States. In the last half-century, starting with the court's famous decision in New York Times versus Sullivan, involving a defamation lawsuit brought by a Montgomery, Alabama city official against the New York Times, the court has created the most speech-protective system in the world. Using the premise of a deep distrust of government involvement in speech and a concomitant fear of the natural human impulse to be intolerant and to suppress the thoughts we hate, the judiciary has embraced a high level of protection for free speech and a free press, especially when the speech concerns public issues. The upshot is that we now live in a society committed to a level of public discourse that, in the Supreme Court's words, is uninhibited, robust, and wide open. As a result, the opportunity for individuals to engage in potentially bad or harmful speech is very, very wide. 3. Our contemporary First Amendment jurisprudence is more complex and fluid than many might imagine. There are several reasons for this. For example, on many of the key issues we will take up in this book, the Supreme Court has taken different, sometimes opposing, positions at various times. To cite just one of many possible examples, in Beauharnais v. Illinois, decided in 1952, the court upheld the constitutionality of a law prohibiting what we would today call hate speech, whereas in Brandenburg v. Ohio, decided in 1969, the court held that the government cannot punish such speech consistent with the First Amendment unless the government can prove that the speech is directed to inciting or producing imminent lawless action and is likely to incite or produce such action. Often in these situations, the earlier decision has not been explicitly overruled, thus leaving open the possibility for its later revival. Moreover, many decisions are vague in their implications, leaving room for a broad range of possible interpretations. As a result, one has to be careful in declaring what the First Amendment means in today's world. The First Amendment is often much more varied and complicated than many experts proclaim, which leads to the next point. 4. The Internet and all that comes with it is not the first instance in which the First Amendment has had to come to terms with a revolutionary new technology of communication. As noted previously, in the last century, the new technology was broadcasting, first radio and then television. People were anxious about broadcasting, and for exactly the same reasons they are now fearful of the power of social media platforms. It was clear from the outset that only a small number of owners would control this new national means of communication because of the physical limits of the electromagnetic spectrum. Indeed, in order for there to be effective communication, there would typically be only 3 television stations per community, and they would each be linked to national programming through the emerging networks, ABC, NBC, and CBS. This concentration of power led to fears that these owners would dominate and censor content, both limiting discussion to only the perspectives and views they embraced, and empowering them to manipulate public opinion through propaganda. This was not a hypothetical problem, as the Nazi regime's uses of radio to advance its evil ends vividly demonstrated. Faced with this challenge, the federal government stepped in, established a new federal agency to exercise oversight, the Federal Communications Commission, and charged it with the authority to issue licenses and establish regulations consistent with the public interest, convenience, and necessity. Censorship by the government was explicitly forbidden, but otherwise the government asserted its authority to oversee this new public resource of communication. This was first established in 1927, and then more comprehensively and permanently in 1934. In 1969, in Red Lion Broadcasting v. FCC, the Supreme Court unanimously upheld this system of government regulation of the broadcast media as constitutional under the First Amendment. At issue was an FCC regulation known as the Fairness Doctrine, under which every broadcaster was required to cover issues of public importance and to do so fairly by giving the public an array of different points of view about those issues. The court held that this was constitutional because the scarcity of the airwaves necessitated government intervention to ensure that the interests of the public were served. Broadcasters were fiduciaries, and the government had a legitimate, perhaps even mandatory role in protecting the public's interest in hearing all points of view. 5 years later, though, in Miami Herald v. Tornillo, the court held that similar regulations of newspapers violated the First Amendment, even though those regulations were also designed to ensure a well-informed public and to restrain the potentially distorting motives of the increasingly powerful and oligopolistic owners of newspapers. The court's decision in Miami Herald did not offer any persuasive explanation as to why newspapers should be treated differently from radio and television networks. As far as the court was concerned, they existed in parallel universes. The problem, as economists observed at the time, was that the scarcity thesis underpinning the broadcast regime was insufficient to distinguish broadcasting from daily newspapers, which by the 1960s had evolved into an operative monopoly in over 90% of American cities. The fact, however, does not necessarily make the system chosen for broadcasting wrong, constitutionally or otherwise, just as it does not necessarily make the alternative system chosen for daily newspapers wrong. One may see this effectively dual system as wrong because each side reflects a philosophy of the First Amendment that is inconsistent with the other. Or one may see the inconsistency as a reasonable, perhaps even wise, experimental approach to a growing common problem, namely that of rising monopolistic private power over the marketplace of ideas and democratic discourse. The pressing question at the moment, and for the purposes of this volume, is what any of this tells us about the future of social media. 5. What is the right thing to do when we are uncertain what to do? Without prejudging the questions on the table about regulation of the Internet and social media platforms, it is worth bearing in mind that uncertainty does not always necessitate inaction. There is value in considering the range of options open to us as we assess the risks and benefits of the current arrangements, including those of taking small or large steps that leave open decisions about other concrete interventions. The Communications Act of 1934 was of its time, in the sense that it relied on an executive branch administrative structure to develop specific regulations over time, with the benefit of experience and under the vague mandate of serving the public interest, convenience, and necessity. Similar thinking may be called for as we contemplate today's challenges. It has been a joy and an education to work with all the participants in this project, and we hope the sum of what is presented here will be as helpful, as challenging, and as stimulating to our listeners as it has been to us. Regulating harmful speech on social media. The current legal landscape and policy proposals. Andrew J. Seresny, Geoffrey P. Cunard, Courtney M. Dankworth, and David A. O'Neill. Social media platforms have transformed how we communicate with one another. They allow us to talk easily and directly to countless others at lightning speed, with no filter and essentially no barriers to transmission. With their enormous user bases and proprietary algorithms that are designed both to promote popular content and to display information based on user preferences, they far surpass any historical antecedents in their scope and power to spread information and ideas. The benefits of social media platforms are obvious and enormous. They foster political and public discourse and civic engagement in the United States and around the world. Social media platforms give voice to marginalized individuals and groups, allowing them to organize, offer support, and hold powerful people accountable. And they allow individuals to communicate with and form communities with others who share their interests but might otherwise have remained disconnected from one another. At the same time, social media platforms, with their directness, immediacy, and lack of filter, enable harmful speech to flourish, including wild conspiracy theories, deliberately false information, foreign propaganda, and hateful rhetoric. The platform's algorithms and massive user bases allow such harmful speech to be disseminated to millions of users at once, and then shared by those users at an exponential rate. This widespread and frictionless transmission of harmful speech has real-world consequences. Conspiracy theories and false information spread on social media have helped sow widespread rejection of COVID-19 public health measures and fueled the lies about the 2020 U.S. presidential election and its result. Violent, racist, and anti-Semitic content on social media has played a role in multiple mass shootings. Social media have also facilitated speech targeted at specific individuals, including doxing, the dissemination of private information, such as home addresses, for malevolent purposes, and other forms of harassment, including revenge porn and cyberbullying. These negative effects of social media discourse are profound and endemic, and they are not going away. Policymakers and stakeholders around the world have called for reform, including by regulating social media companies' approaches to the dissemination of harmful speech on their platforms. This introductory essay sets the context in which policymakers might think about how to approach the challenges of harmful speech on social media platforms, including by making such reforms. It first briefly summarizes the U.S. statutory and constitutional framework for approaching the regulation of social media platforms. It then reviews potential U.S. policy approaches, with a particular focus on proposed and implemented legislation concerning social media platforms in the European Union. Statutory and constitutional barriers to addressing harmful speech on social media. There are significant barriers in the United States to limiting, regulating, or prohibiting speech on social media that is harmful but lawful. To begin with, much harmful speech is lawful, including hateful or racist speech and non-commercial speech that is false or misleading. Users cannot be held legally liable for posting such content. Likewise, social media platforms do not have legal liability for their role in the spread of lawful speech or for removal or moderation of such content. Although the victims of unlawful speech, such as defamation, on social media can sue the speaker, private suits offer little recourse for victims when such speech is instantaneously disseminated across the Internet. The victim also cannot sue the platform because of Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, U.S. Code 47, Section 230, which now immunizes social media platforms from most legal claims arising from user content posted on their sites and the platform's moderation of that content, or lack thereof. This immunity has been widely credited with allowing the Internet to flourish, but also criticized for allowing social media giants to escape liability for harmful speech on their platforms. Even if Section 230 were repealed, however, social media platforms still could not be held legally liable for harmful but not unlawful speech. Going beyond existing statutes and common law doctrines, policymakers could try to regulate lawful speech, but that regulation must comport with the First Amendment. As described later, the First Amendment, as applied to the users who post on social media platforms and the social media platforms themselves, has been interpreted to substantially limit government's ability to regulate lawful speech. Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. Section 230 provides broad immunity for online platforms that host or republish speech against a range of claims that might otherwise be used to hold them legally responsible for what their users say or do. Specifically, Section 230 states that providers of interactive computer services, including social media companies, cannot be held liable both for their decisions to host and disseminate content created by others and for actions they take voluntarily and in good faith to restrict access to certain types of material. There are certain limited exceptions related to federal criminal activity, such as obscenity and sexual exploitation of children, electronic privacy laws, and intellectual property protection. Congress passed Section 230 in 1996 in response to Stratton Oakmont Incorporated versus Prodigy Services Company. In that case, a New York trial court held that an online service provider could be held liable for defamatory material posted by its users to the extent that the provider was republishing the material rather than simply distributing it. The court relied on well-settled principles of defamation law, under which publishers and republishers of defamatory material can be held liable for the defamation, whereas mere distributors of such content, such as a library, may not be. Congress was concerned that, absent statutory protection, online service providers would be disincentivized to remove defamatory content because, in doing so, they could be regarded as a publisher of the content.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?